Christina Behme has a PhD in philosophy from Dalhousie University. She works mainly in philosophy of language and linguistics. You might know her if you read in those areas for her work on Chomsky, anti-Chomsky generally. Also writes on evolution, the evolution of language in particular. She was a critic of Jerry Fodor's book on evolution, and is interested in Plato and other things philosophical. Right now she's working at Brandon University. She's there for the year. And Christina was born in East Germany, and so she's going to tell us about does banning hate speech eliminate hatred, the case of East Germany. Christina Behme.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you also for inviting me. I have attempted giving a talk on that for a long time, but for some strange reason people kind of don't want me to talk about that. I suspect in some ways I will be preaching to a choir today, but I still would appreciate especially critical feedback. The idea to that talk actually came quite some time ago when the debate started about whether or not we should eliminate hate speech. So usually there are some justifications given for why one should interfere with free speech. I will be talking briefly about that. I will be talking about the limits that we had on hate speech in East Germany, both the limits to exposure, but also to doing it yourself, what that did in terms of self-censorship, and most importantly, obviously, did it work? The short answer is no, but it's a lot more complex than that. And I will be talking about the short-term and the long-term limits about effects on banning hate speech and why we here in Canada should be concerned. So yeah, when we talk about freedom, or apologies for those things being messed up, it's because of the PowerPoints. Freedom of speech in Canada is protected as a fundamental freedom by Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but it is not an absolute right. So Canada, like many countries, has some limitations on freedom of speech, and especially Section 1 of the Charter allows the government to pass laws that limit the free expression so long as the limits can be justified and are reasonable. And of course, it's kind of like a long way what is actually reasonable. People don't quite agree on that. Hate speech and obscenity are usually examples that are used to justify exceptions. So there are several sections of the criminal code in Canada that make limitations on the freedom of speech. So you cannot promote genocide, you cannot publicly incite hatred against people based on their color, race, religion, ethnic origin, and so on, except where the statements made are true and are made in good faith. I guess we all have come across examples where that was not quite the case. So in general, the reason given for limits on free speech is one that goes back to Mill, the no harm principle. So free speech is a very important human right. Everybody agrees on that. However, in special cases, exercising this right can cause harm, and harm prevention always trumps free speech. The obvious question is, does it actually work? Is it really the case that if we ban certain speech, that we will be limiting harm? Now, free speech in East Germany, it may come as a huge surprise, was actually also protected by our constitution. We had 3 of them, 3 constitutions, and they all protected free speech. in the last one, paragraph 27, granted every citizen the right to free speech and freedom of the printed press, radio, and television. Of course, we also had limits. The criminal code listed staatsfeindliche Hetze, subversive agitation, and Missbrauch der Medien für die bürgerliche Ideologie, misuse of media for bourgeois ideology as punishable offenses. So even though in theory we were free to say everything, in reality it wasn't quite like that. Our first constitution also has the ban of hate speech in Article 6. So essentially, boycott, instigation against democratic organizations, murder instigations against democratic politicians, expression of religious, racial, ethnic hatred, and so on were punishable offenses by East German law. Nevertheless, all citizens have the right, within the limits of existing law, of course, to express their opinion freely and to assemble for the purposes freely and unarmed. The freedom is not impeded by any employment relationship, and no one can have disadvantages from making use of that right. Doesn't that sound familiar? And there is to be no censorship of the press. So all of those things were actually in the East German constitution. And our official picture, supported also by much of our official symbolism, was one of egalitarianism. So this communist idea, all people are equal regardless of nationality, gender, color, skin, religion, sexual orientation, and so on. We put a really strong emphasis on unity, at least unity of the good forces, the workers, farmers, members of different parties, and so on. And strong emphasis also on principles of international solidarity, friendship between peoples, solidarity with victims of capitalist oppression. All of that sounds really familiar, doesn't it? Xenophobia and racism were acknowledged to cause harm, but they were all seen as part of imperialistic, capitalistic domination that will be overcome in our wonderful communist society. We worked a lot on international solidarity. Again, the official picture was that we would be helping people in oppressed countries. The not so official picture was that East Germany provided mainly military support and personal training. So there are stories that a ship that got in distress and was transporting solidarity goods to one of our friends in Africa had to actually turn away the 3 nearest ships because they were non-communist ships. And they would not have been delighted to see that all the solidarity goods were actually pretty nasty weapons that were used, obviously, to fuel the civil war in those countries. But officially, we were just supporting oppressed people. So Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, you probably from history know that all those were countries that liberated themselves from allegedly capitalist oppression. And of course, relevant here to elimination of hate speech is that most of the people living there were of different skin color, of different religion, of different ethnic backgrounds than East Germans, but they were all officially our friends. And so one part of the idea how this was supposed to work was that, well, we educate our kids and we start early on. So already in daycare, were kids constantly exposed to the ideas of international solidarity. And it is actually telling that you still can find those kind of images online because, I mean, East Germany didn't have a great presence on the internet for obvious reasons. But that really was the kind of stuff that our kids already in daycare were exposed to on an ongoing basis. All our socialist youth organizations actively promoted those ideas of inclusion and friendship. We had letter friendships with people with kids from mainly the Soviet Union, but also countries from Cuba, Angola, and so on. We were actively collecting secondary materials, selling them, and all that money basically donating for solidarity. They were already at daycare age, there were competitions in that. So if you were a member of a children's group that donated more money for solidarity than the other kids, then you got at the end of the school year some kind of reward for that. Xenophobic, racist, sexist speech causes harm, and therefore it was always discouraged. And for smaller children, that discouragement was still pretty mild, but it was made very clear. You do not say anything nasty, bad, and whatever about people of other skin color and so on. The indoctrination obviously continued throughout high school and university. Older students then were taught the Marxist foundation of equality in a communist society. This one was about our solidarity with Nicaragua. But in general, whenever there was any conflict, the youth of East Germany was standing strongly together with those oppressed people. The support, like the competitions in support, got more and more intense. I recall when we were like in grade 12, we had a huge debate about how we could increase our financial support, and it became infamous as the pudding debates, because at one point we were actually really fiercely debating whether it was more effective to make vanilla or chocolate pudding and sell it to unsuspecting people. But yeah, this was the kind of craziness that was actually going on. And the really bad thing is we didn't really think it was that crazy. It seemed pretty normal for us. We had international youth projects, and we also were extensively exposed to all the harms that had come from colonialism, oppression, genocide, xenophobia. So everybody who grew up in East Germany at one point or another had been in one of the concentration camps. And our official stand always was that that was the most horrible thing that ever had happened. And part of the, why it was so horrible was because it was based on hatred of the other. So there was also obviously a strong emphasis on the connection between hate speech, hatred, and imperialism, and now the punishment was pretty severe. If at that point you still had not gotten it, that you do not talk badly about other people, you were severely punished. So most people, by the time they came to university, they knew how to shut up about those things. At the workplace, things continued, so we had lots and lots of exchange students and workers that came to East Germany to get an education and or work experience. I can say something in the Q&A about that. We also had some immigrants from third world countries. Believe it or not, there were people that voluntarily immigrated into East Germany. Well, voluntarily, very often they came from war-torn regions, and it was kind of between being killed immediately or living in East Germany, and so it didn't look that bad. So the expectation obviously was, if you are working together with people of different cultures, you will be exposed to their worldview and you will just learn to love them, to enjoy them, and vice versa. And there continued to be education about the bad effects of hate speech, and there was really zero tolerance for sexism, xenophobia, racism. So nobody would have been stupid enough and publicly say something like, we really should get rid of the Vietnamese immigrants or something like that. That just did not happen. Now, obviously, trust is good, control is better. So, yes, we did everything we could positively to educate our citizens how wonderful it is to live in a world of harmony. But we also knew that evil imperialism was just sitting next door. And those nasty people actually had TV and radio. And we could not really shield our citizens entirely from it. It was tried in the beginning. It didn't really quite work. So we came up with this wonderful, wonderful TV program. Anybody who understands German, I really strongly encourage you to watch an episode or two to get an idea. That's probably more than most East German citizens actually ever watch. But so the idea was we can do damage control. What Karl Eduard von Schnitzler did was he played clips from West German media, and then he gave an East German commentary on it. And, well, can probably imagine how that went over. And in order to really entice people, that wonderful show was sandwiched between two rather popular evening shows, Monday evening, but it turned out most people found something or other to do in those 45 minutes. It attracted less than 5% viewers, and if you know that how many people in East Germany actually were members of the Communist Party, not even the party members watched that wonderful show. We also had something in East Germany that was called das Tal der Ahnungslosen, the Valley of the Clueless. And those were two areas. This one is especially important around Dresden. The one around, up in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern is not that important simply because not so many people lived there. And those were areas that really did not have any exposure to West German television, simply due to their geographics. And the people that lived in this Tal der Ahnungslosen were only exposed to East German propaganda. And yes, they may have had relatives in the West, and they may have been talking to people who knew about media in the West, but frankly, East Germans were not really that political. So we didn't go out of our way to get access to that kind of stuff. Now, if banning hate speech has actually a positive effect, then people living in the Valley of the Clueless should be less xenophobic than people in the former GDR who actually were exposed to at least some of this hate propaganda coming from the West. Where are they? Would you like to take a wild guess? Right. Now, people in all areas of East Germany rarely watched any political education shows like Der Schwarze Kanal, and most East Germans had some exposure to West German hate propaganda and critical engagement with it on West German radio and TV. Now, after the wall came down and we all get equal exposure to this evil West German propaganda, it turned out that people who lived in the valley of the Clueless were actually significantly more likely to vote for the extreme right and to be racist and xenophobic. That's rather distressing, isn't it? If all this effort really doesn't work. So the question is, why did it not really work that well? Okay, let's backtrack. Officially, it really looked like that. We are friends with everybody. The more different from us, the better, but friends really with everybody. Xenophobia and racism did not exist in East Germany. And because of that strict ban on hate speech, there were really never any of those kind of views expressed. Because, hey, we knew there would be serious consequences. And if, as a government, you make it clear enough that you will punish people seriously enough, they don't do that kind of stuff. And it was also rarely expressed in private, partly because people were kind of concerned about Stasi, but partly because it really didn't seem that good of an idea to begin with. If xenophobia and racism were discussed at all, it was a problem of somebody else, not us. It was the problem of imperialism, and to some degree, many East Germans felt morally superior. And that is an experience that is very difficult to actually justify. Because when you really look at it, East Germans on average probably were not any more moral than West Germans, and we really hadn't much reason to believe so. Nevertheless, a lot of us convinced ourselves that we really were morally at least superior. When it really happened that there was some hostility towards foreigners, it was attributed to, well, people were just drunk, or maybe somebody was mentally challenged, or maybe somebody really had been exposed to evil capitalist, imperialist propaganda. But if it really was noticed at all, it was quickly explained away. And of course, if a problem doesn't exist, hey, we don't need to talk about it. The unofficial story is very different. There was always some kind of resentment towards foreigners, but it was always kind of bubbling underneath the surface. And in part, people justified that by the sheer paternalism that we were exposed to. So if somebody constantly tells you you should be good friends with people from the Soviet Union, at one point you just had it. And even though you had no reason not to be friends with people from the Soviet Union, well, just kind of to be contrarian. So that was one issue that we all were aware of. True integration also rarely happened. So many of the foreigners actually lived in special segregated areas, really. Romantic relationships were discouraged for a huge number of reasons. Some of them were simply logistics. Imagine if a boy or a girl from East Germany fell madly in love with somebody who lived in a country they couldn't travel to. That wasn't really a good idea. It very rarely happened. It then also happened that sometimes you ended up in countries that had very different ideas about, for instance, equality between the genders. And so our Ministry for Foreign Affairs, I forget the exact title, they once in a while got involved in actually trying to get people from East Germany back to East Germany. There was a widely discussed on the surface case of a young girl who married somebody and who managed to actually get Ausreise in that country, and 3 years later she had been traded for 3 goats, and she wasn't quite happy with her new owner, and so there was lots and lots of political footwork involved to get her back home to East Germany, and she was one of the few people who actually then was quite happy to live in East Germany. There was a lot of self-censorship and outwardly polite behavior towards foreigners. Xenophobic and racist attacks unfortunately happened. They happened more in the Valley of the Clueless, but not exclusively there. And the numbers are only coming out, like all of those statistics have been published long after the wall came down, because the Stasi, but also our government, was not interested in anybody knowing about numbers and that cases existed at all. So some say at least 12 foreigners were killed in purely racist attacks. Others say 10 people. In my opinion, every single one is one too many. Right, so it already didn't work that well in East Germany. Yes, officially, hate to foreigners, xenophobia didn't exist, but it did. But way, way more importantly was what happened once the ban on hate speech actually ended, once the wall came down. Now, actually, a lot of things happened once the wall came down. And most East Germans were quite aware that xenophobia and racism wasn't exactly something to like wave a big flag for in West Germany either. And so, again, people would not talk openly about it. After the initial euphoria when the wall came down, a lot of people faced a lot of problems they had never really been prepared to deal with. Unemployment was obviously the #1 issue that most Germans had no clue how to actually deal with. Increasing cost of living. Relationship problems. If somebody found out that their beloved brother, sister was working for the Stasi, that usually didn't help much with family relationships. Fraud from both West and East Germans, adjusting to unfamiliar, confusing legal system, and so on. There was also rapidly growing inequality, something that didn't exist to that degree in East Germany at all, and it obviously wasn't really that great. The safety nets didn't really work that well because we never had really a need for it. Unemployment skyrocketed, and many East Germans, as I said, had no coping mechanisms dealing with that. And at the same time, there was an increased influx of refugees from all areas of the world. West Germany always had this wonderful propaganda. Germany is the homeland for every German. And that was all fine and dandy as long as there was this nice wall separating East and West Germany, because even though we East Germans would have loved to live in West Germany, we couldn't. And turns out it wasn't just East Germans. There are a lot of people of German descent that live all over the world. Relevantly, there were a lot of those people that lived in former communist countries. And some of them were like 4, 5, 6 generations Ukrainians, Russians. They didn't speak a word of German, but they had some German ancestry. And so they came in large numbers to Germany. And they were mixed up with political refugees and so on. And a lot of the foreign workers in East Germany actually worked not in jobs as was promised to them, where they would get a great education, but in jobs that East Germans really were not that keen on doing. And that was all fine and dandy during East German times, but all of a sudden, those jobs were better than no jobs. So they began a pretty intense competition for a decreasing number of jobs. And especially visible minorities were seen as a cause of many of those problems. So there was an escalation of xenophobic violence, long-pent resentments boiled over, a growing number of those Asylbewerberheime that were places where refugees first were living while their cases were decided. They were placed in former East Germany with really virtually no regard to the local problems. And there was also an inability or unwillingness of the local police force to address those problems. And one of the most scary examples, and one closest to home for me, was in August of 1992 in Rostock-Lichtenhagen. It was the worst mob attack in post-war Germany. It is an absolute miracle that nobody got killed during that attack. I was actually at that time living in Nova Scotia, and people were asking me, isn't that where you just lived in East Germany? I said, yeah, it's about 5 blocks from where I had been living. And people stared at me and said, you want to go back there? And yeah, it was frightening. It was absolutely frightening. In an area, again, what allegedly was so friendly, welcoming, and so on to foreigners. Again, I can talk a little bit about it in Q&A. This house, the Sunflower House, officially, for, again, obvious reasons, had already been basically a residence for workers from mostly Vietnam, and it had a very unflattering nickname amongst Rostockers. It was called the Ape House. And we all thought that was really, really funny. And probably most people really just thought that was innocent joking. But it turned out that this kind of not paying any attention whatsoever to what people actually were thinking, and only paying attention to the official story can have pretty devastating effects. Now, some people might be tempted to say, yeah, well, that was shortly after the wall came down, and people had lots and lots and lots of problems. But surely, some 30 years, or almost 30 years later, things have evened out, have improved, right? Well, when you look at the German elections, and especially at the results of the extreme right-wing National Democratic Party.
What is its translation?
Nationale Demokratische Partei, or something like that. In East Germany, that was one that you were not supposed to know that it even existed. A lot of people call it the Nazi Party. It is constantly under legal attack. And yes, it is extremely right-wing. And there are some similar parties now populating the landscape. But it was only voted into local government 4 times after 1990. It had some success in the 1960s in West Germany, but then it was kind of around 0.1 to 2% in like former West Germany. And the highest result that they ever achieved, 9.2%. So 1 out of 10 people essentially was voting for somebody who is pretty close to real Nazis, not the kind of stuff that's going on in the United States, but real Nazis. In Saxony and also in all of the other new countries, they are a lot more popular than they are in former West Germany. So it is not just the case that it didn't work while it lasted, that ban. It's a case that it has long-term effects, apparently. And 1991, the Unwerth of the year was ausländerfrei, that means without foreigners. And that is one of the many slogans that the extreme right is using. And many of those instances are still in former East Germany. Essentially, each time when they want to build a place where refugees can stay, and it is in East Germany, you will have those huge protests against them. Now, why should we be worried about it? Because I think, even though officially there was no racism, no xenophobia, and so on in East Germany, those problems did not just arise overnight. It was not the case that all of a sudden East Germans turned really, really nasty. It was the case that in many instances people were reluctant to embrace foreigners in the way we ought to embrace foreigners for a variety of reasons. But they were never really talking about it. And if you don't talk about it, then you cannot really make an argument to people for why they shouldn't hate foreigners, for instance. And if you shut up people who even remotely suggest something that is hateful, then, well, people learn to shut up and to not openly express themselves. So what we did in East Germany did not work. And the reason that is so frightening really is because that was one of the very few areas where a lot of people actually thought East German communism did work. It was not like our pathetically bad economics. It was not like our pathetically bad foreign politics. It was something where a lot of people think, yeah, if you really educate your kids in a spirit of being nice to everybody, embrace everybody, and if you shut out all those other voices, you will end up with a much more inclusive population. Now, in the United States and in Canada, we have increasingly seeing attacks on free speech, and we obviously will be hearing something about that from somebody who has suffered under those attacks. And what that really shows is not just that that it is obviously very, very unfortunate to be at the receiving end of those attacks. But what is at least equally worrisome is that it doesn't seem to be doing any good for the groups that ought to be protected by that interference with free speech. And I guess I just stop here. Thanks for your attention.
My name is Frances Widdowson, for people I don't know. I'm the coordinator for membership outreach, trying to get more members to this organization. Anyway, I really appreciated your talk, and I'm interested in the extent to which restrictions on speech actually increase, I guess, resentment towards others. I think that's a very, very intellectually sound position. I'm not quite sure, though, about the causes. Like, there's an underlying cause of people being discriminatory or disliking others, and then there's the added problem of the restrictions on speech, which prevent us from kind of working through the actual problems which exist. And I just wanted your opinion on some of the potential causes which are sort of competition for employment. That seems to be a major aspect. So it will increase when people feel threatened and they feel that they cannot sustain themselves. And secondly, which I'm not sure if this happened in the case of the German situation, mixing up different factors. So, and I think this is happening now in Canada, which is you have certain cultural problems whereby people have conflicts. I'm just thinking of Islamic culture and the sort of the problems of gender equality and so on, and then racial sorts of arguments, Nazi arguments about that it is in fact racial inferiority that is the problem, and mixing those two things up really, and preventing speech to discuss it, really prevents us from trying to understand some of the cultural problems which are plaguing our society. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that, and whether that played out in the German situation.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. Let me try to address them kind of in reverse. The problem of xenophobia, of hate of the other, is something that arises very early. And I think we all have experiences where like a 3-year-old will say something like, "Mom, why does that person look black?" or something to that effect. And if at that point, what we did in East Germany, essentially, you already kind of gives the message that those are bad questions to ask. You actually eliminate an opportunity of children actually expressing something that is pretty normal. And so kids learn very, very quickly to just shut up. That does not mean that they don't think that fat kids are funny, or that black kids don't look different than white kids, or that kids that wear the hijab or stuff like that don't look funny. But if you never ever talk about that, you teach your own kids that something that they are curious about is something they shouldn't be curious about. And so that interferes with really important curiosity. And obviously, if a child says something like, "I don't like the fat kid," you can also ask them, "So why should I like the fat kid?" And I notice very often in Canada, when we talk about tolerance, the answer has actually nothing to do with tolerance. So if somebody says something like, "Why should I be tolerant of Muslims?" the answer is, "Well, I have friends who are Muslims, and they are wonderful people. They are really working hard. They take really great care of their kids." That's great, but that's not a reason for being tolerant. That's a reason for why you should appreciate them. Being tolerant would be something like, well, somebody always makes loud music at night, but otherwise they're nice people, so you should be actually putting up with something that you don't like. That is what we mean when we talk about being tolerant. In Canada, we rarely ever dare to talk about what is wrong with other people or with us. If in Canada you are part of a victim group, you are kind of immune against any form of criticism. And that is the problem. Being a white person doesn't make me a good person, but neither does being a black person or being a native-born person make me automatically a good person. And so that we never really have those kind of debates. And it's very, very similar to what happened in East Germany. You just don't talk about it. Now, the question about competition for jobs and stuff like that, it's a very tricky question. I mean, like, I have been living in Nova Scotia for almost 25 years now, and I do notice that there are problems when we are having really well-intended laws, for instance, that the natives have different quota in fishing than non-native fisher persons. And it very often does not do what it is intended to do. You cannot, I think, right wrongs that have been committed in the past by committing now wrongs against people who were not responsible for those wrongs and who are very often under intense pressure to provide for their families. But what you are doing very often in those cases is you create resentment. Why are the natives allowed to go fishing when we are not allowed to do it? And the resentment, unfortunately, in many cases is not directed against the government, but it's directed against the native people. So you actually create a problem that is way worse than what you want to address.
It's very interesting stuff. The one thing I'm troubled with is looking at a possible alternative explanation to your results.
Sure.
Could it not be that prevention of hate speech works better for people exposed to Western values than people who are not exposed to Western values? Mm-hmm. And how does that affect what you're saying about hate speech?
Well, I mean, the case of Germany is so interesting because in a way we were both. In a way, a lot of Germans, of East Germans obviously had grown up in capitalist, fascist Germany and still had all kinds of connections to the West. And propaganda from the West, and don't get me wrong when I use the word propaganda. I mean virtually anything that came from West, German television, radio shows, and so on was accessible. So that's why that case is so unique. In all of the other former communist countries, you didn't have that constant influx of opinions that were very different from the official view. And I think that is at least what worries me here in Canada, is that we kind of gravitate towards that. We have this official view of how we should be treating people. Like, for instance, how we should treat transgender people. There's an official view now. And if you disagree with that official view, well, you better watch your back. And that, unfortunately, again, has not the effect that people become more tolerant of transgender people. It has the exact opposite effect. It has the effect that people who, under normal circumstances, probably wouldn't have an opinion whatsoever, get annoyed. And that getting annoyed is the first step towards doing more nasty things. And so I think the things that have happened in East Germany are relevant because we have tried the very things that are now being tried in Canadian universities, in US universities. And we were, in a way, participants in an experiment where we never gave consent that this experiment would be conducted on us. But why should we not try to learn from those results that are really showing that this kind of stuff backfires? And I mean, don't get me wrong, East Germans were not kind of like 110% indoctrinated all the time. Most of us were not really that political. Most East Germans had similar aspirations as people all over the world. We wanted to live a good life. And yes, this constant political propaganda, it was bloody annoying, but we really didn't pay that much attention to it either.
Second, Phil. And then Heinz.
Just a quick question. One of my favorite quotes is from the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov, where he talks about fundamentalist Christians as, what is it, armies of the night with their Bibles held high, and all we have is the feeble lance of mere reason. What I think he was driving at is that there's an underlying tribalism that's been we've evolved into, And I don't think we take sufficient account of that in terms of combating these issues. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I agree that there are reasons, and I think we have to acknowledge that we are not internally those wonderful, wonderful people that are just then corrupted by bad circumstance or something like that, but that a lot of us actually prefer people of our own race or people of our own religion, people of our own ethnicity. And when we are exposed to the other, we have this kind of initial step back, and you can watch that everywhere. I mean, if you go to if you drive through Nova Scotia on the eastern shore, those charming little fishing villages, wonderful people, they are extremely friendly, polite, to a certain degree. But you are an outsider, and you have to be aware of that actually exists. And then each time people express that, you just kind of like scream at them, you racist, you horrible person. Well, they will not openly express it anymore. But you don't extinguish the underlying feelings by eliminating talking about it. And I think what really would be important is actually talking about it. And that is something that obviously has to be done with a lot of, what's the English word for Fingerspitzengefühl? Fingerspitzengefühl. Right. Thank you.
Heinz, and then David, and then Ron. Everybody very quickly, please, because we want to get to lunch. Heinz.
I see things a little different.
Okay.
To argue that there was prohibition of xenophobia and etc., I think that was the case, but it was quite theoretical. What was much more important was the active incitement of hatred that was so active and so prevalent and everywhere, in the media, in the school system, of course. And I see the dynamics psychologically differently than you. I don't think that the prohibition of hatred resulted in people today choosing the NDP. I think that is too direct a line from one reason, from one cause to the other. The hatred was very practical, very real in everybody's life. You were told to hate, and you were taught to hate, and you were instructed to hate, and psychologically the dynamics are different from how you depicted it.
Okay. Fair enough. What you obviously talk about is the hatred of the Klassenfeind. And you're absolutely right. That was obviously justified by Marxist propaganda, that the enemy of the working class are imperialists, there is no such thing as good imperialists, and so on. And you're absolutely right. That was something that was constantly, we were constantly exposed to. Speaking for the people, myself, my friends, people I came in contact with, we just kind of ignored that. It was like, yeah, okay, they are the Klassenfeind. And so there were those things like, why is your grandma who lives in West Germany your enemy and stuff like that. Seriously. The people I know, they didn't take that part seriously. Yes, there were people who worked for the party who took that very seriously, but it was a kind of propaganda that was so predictable that most of us said, yeah, okay, we hate them. Just let's move on. For a lot of people, there was no hatred towards your relatives that lived in West Germany. Again, for some there was, but I don't think that hatred actually really was internalized in the way you may have experienced it.
It was a wonderful talk, and you made some points that other people have made that I think are very important, that need to be somehow accelerated in our political and cultural climate. But there's one thing I wonder if you would agree with. This contrast, this conflict between, let's say, resentment and perception, which is how I see it, restrictions on free speech or the inability to pronounce anything that might be interpreted as hate speech, I think you're quite right, will lead to a kind of increase in nastiness, an inability to understand the other, an unwillingness to understand the other, simply because you were never able to express your feelings, your opinions, your desires, whatever. But also, it doesn't only lead to, I think, a kind of blanket hatred of the other or a blanket resentment of the other. It leads also to the inability to make distinctions, to perceive different aspects of the other, namely those aspects which are perhaps harmful to cultural, to cultural continuity, and those aspects which are actually beneficial.
Yeah.
I noticed that you mentioned very often that the result of this restriction may lead in the course of time to the incursion of right-wing elements, far-right, or what is called alt-right these days. You didn't mention the incursion of left-wing, the alt-left-wing, which is, I think, what is happening in the U.S. now, with Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, the so-called Antifas, the inability to speak at Berkeley, where, in fact, I was educated. At one time. I was there with the free speech movement, which no longer exists. Mario Savio is dead, but he's dead in more ways than one now. So I wonder, you see, if there is something to be said about the inability to say, okay, these immigrants, like my parents who came over, worked hard, paid taxes, and had absolutely no advantages accruing to them as a result of this, from immigrants that come over, as we see in Germany, where you have a sensibility, a third world sensibility perhaps, or a tribal, as you were mentioning, sensibility, which is actually antithetical to the continuity of the culture as it has developed over millennia. So this restriction on free speech means we can't talk about the other, but we can't talk about what's even right about the other, if we wish to, but we can't talk about what's wrong with the other. And I wonder if we shouldn't just say, okay, on one side it leads to the alt-right, on the other side it leads to the alt-left, because nobody can say effectively why perhaps we shouldn't have unlimited immigration.
Thank you very much. I absolutely agree with you, and I should have said that it's not just the extreme right wing is very strong in former East Germany. Believe it or not, the extreme left wing is also extremely strong there. So what you don't have that much in former East Germany is kind of the middle. At least you have it a lot less than you have it in former West Germany. And the reason I didn't address it that much in my talk is because I wanted to emphasize that what is going on in the United States on the left right now is actually kind of very similar to what we had, and with very similar justifications. You don't talk badly about the foreigners. You could harm them and that kind of stuff. And what I try to say to those people is, look, we tried that. It does not work. And it does not work for reasons that you mentioned, that we have to look, if we really are interested in helping oppressed peoples, we have to look at not just what is good about them, but also about their limitations. And what I would add to that is we really have to stop to celebrate this kind of wallowing in misery. The impression that I get in a lot of the philosophical debates is that there is some competition about who is the most oppressed group, and that there is some prize to be won for that. And the problem with that is, first of all, nobody ever can win that competition, because if you claim victory, then you're not as miserable as somebody else. But the really, really frightening thing is, who on earth wants to win that competition? Who in their right mind wants to win a competition for being most miserable? What we want to do...
Failures in society want to win the competition.
Well, not even failures really want to win the competition, but it seems to me that there are some people now that have almost a vested interest in keeping people miserable. And the celebration of misery is something I really have a hard time relating to.
Our last question, very quick.
Very quick. Christina, you can answer this very quickly too.
Okay?
Why was it called the Schwarze Canal?
There is in mining, there's this black bilge kind of stuff, like it's a very poisonous garbage kind of thing, and that is called der Schwarze Kanal.
And that was the official name of that television station.
Yes, the Schwarze Kanal then was referring to the television shows from West Germany. So that was compared to this really, really poisonous, horrible...
Here's what I wanted to build onto that. What is the role of CBC in Canada? And secondly, I want to throw in the question that came up. We talked about the moral superiority that all of us are experiencing today. Who is superior to whom? And all we got to do is think about our friends to the south. I traveled right across this country this past winter, and without a doubt, every Canadian I spoke to derided the people in the south. I'll leave it to there.
Thank you very much.